Imagine inventing something so perfect it dictates the outcome of global conflicts, generates billions of dollars, and becomes the absolute gold standard of engineering for over a century. Your name becomes synonymous with precision. Your creation is held by millions. You build an empire that seems entirely untouchable. Now, imagine watching that entire empire burn to the ground. Imagine losing absolutely everything. Your factories dismantled, your patents seized, your legacy buried under the rubble of history. This is the story of Paul and Wilhelm Mauser, two brothers from a small town in Germany who created the most influential firearm in human history, built a global monopoly, and then lost their entire empire in one of the most devastating corporate collapses the world has ever seen. How did two men go from ruling the global arms trade to losing it all? What's the most tragic business failure you've ever heard of? Let me know in the comments below, because the Mauser story might just beat it. To understand the sheer magnitude of their rise and their eventual devastating fall, we have to go back to 1838. In a small, quiet town in the Kingdom of Württemberg, Paul Mauser was born into a family that practically lived and breathed metalwork. His father was a master gunsmith at the Royal Rifle Factory. But Paul wasn't just a mechanic, he was a visionary. Along with his older brother Wilhelm, who had an absolute genius for business and networking, they formed a partnership that would soon change the face of warfare forever. In the late 19th century, firearms were rapidly evolving. The transition from muzzle loaders to breech loaders was in full swing, and every major military power was desperately searching for the ultimate rifle. Paul Mauser spent years obsessively tinkering, trying to perfect a bolt-action mechanism. He wanted something that was robust, reliable, and practically indestructible. While Paul was the mad scientist, locked in the workshop, Wilhelm was the salesman. He traveled across Europe, pitching their designs to highly skeptical military generals. They faced constant rejection. The Prussian military initially laughed them out of the room, but the brothers refused to quit. Their first major breakthrough came in 1871. The German Empire officially adopted their design, the Mauser Model 1871. It was a massive validation, but it was only the beginning. The brothers used the profits to buy the Royal Rifle Factory in Oberndorf, the very same factory where their father had worked. They were no longer just inventors, they were industrialists. But Paul Mauser wasn't satisfied. He knew the Model 1871 wasn't perfect. He spent the next 20 years obsessively refining the bolt-action system. He introduced the stripper clip, allowing soldiers to load 5 rounds in seconds. He perfected the extractor, ensuring the gun would almost never jam. And then, in 1898, Paul unleashed his masterpiece, the Gewehr 98. This wasn't just a rifle. This was a mechanical marvel. The Gewehr 98 was so incredibly well designed, so fundamentally perfect, that it instantly made almost every other rifle on Earth obsolete. The bolt-action mechanism was a stroke of absolute engineering genius. It was reliable in mud, in snow, in the trenches. If you're fascinated by how a single invention can completely alter the course of history, drop a like on this video. The Gewehr 98 became the standard issue rifle for the German military, but the Mauser brothers didn't stop there. Wilhelm's relentless business acumen meant that Mauser didn't just arm Germany, they armed the world. By the early 20th century, Mauser was exporting millions of rifles across the globe. From South America to the Ottoman Empire, from China to Spain, the Mauser rifle became the undisputed gold standard. Their factory in Oberndorf expanded into a massive industrial city. They employed thousands of workers. They built schools, hospitals, and housing for their employees. They were the undisputed kings of the global arms trade. The Mauser name carried an aura of absolute invincibility. They had achieved the ultimate capitalist dream. They had built a product so undeniably superior that the entire world had no choice but to buy it. But with massive success comes massive risk, and the Mauser brothers were about to learn that when your business is built on supplying empires, you fall when the empires fall. World War I erupted, and millions of Mauser rifles flooded the trenches of Europe. The factory ran day and night, churning out weapons at an unprecedented scale. But when the war ended in 1918, Germany was entirely crushed. The Treaty of Versailles was signed, and its terms were absolutely devastating. Germany was strictly forbidden from manufacturing military weapons. Almost overnight, the Mauser factory went from the beating heart of a global empire to a silent, empty shell. To survive, the company had to desperately pivot. The greatest firearms engineers on Earth were suddenly forced to manufacture calculating machines, sewing machines, and measuring tools. It was a humiliating downgrade. The empire was bleeding. Do you think the brothers were naive for tying their entire fortune to military contracts, or just victims of historical circumstance? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. Despite the crushing restrictions, the Mauser legacy refused to die. In the shadows, they continued to quietly innovate. When the restrictions were eventually lifted in the 1930s, Mauser returned to what they did best. They developed the Karabiner 98K, a shorter, more refined version of Paul's original masterpiece. Once again, millions of Mauser rifles were produced. Once again, the factory in Oberndorf was the center of a military-industrial juggernaut. But this time, they were supplying a regime that would drag the world into the darkest conflict in human history. World War II pushed the Mauser factory to its absolute limits, but as the war turned against Germany, the walls began to close in on the Mauser Empire. In 1945, the Allied forces pushed deep into Germany. The French army captured the town of Oberndorf, and this is where the tragic downfall of the Mauser brothers reaches its absolute climax. The French didn't just capture the factory, they systematically dismantled it. Every single machine, every blueprint, every prototype was seized. What couldn't be taken was destroyed. The massive factory complex, the heart of the Mauser empire that Paul and Wilhelm had spent their entire lives building, was rigged with explosives and blown to pieces. But the humiliation didn't stop there. The patents, the brilliant, world-changing intellectual property that Paul Mauser had painstakingly developed, were entirely stripped away. The Mauser bolt-action design was simply taken, copied, and utilized by arms manufacturers all over the globe, without a single cent of royalties ever going back to the Mauser family. We uncover the hidden stories behind history's greatest empires and biggest downfalls every single week. If you're enjoying this deep dive, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The legacy of Paul and Wilhelm Mauser is one of the most bitter ironies in business history. Today, if you look at almost any modern bolt-action hunting rifle, from the Winchester Model 70 to the modern Remington 700, you are looking at a direct descendant of Paul Mauser's brilliant design. His engineering was so fundamentally perfect that, over a century later, nobody has been able to improve upon it in any meaningful way. The Mauser brothers completely revolutionized an industry. They built a global monopoly based on pure, undeniable quality. But because their product was so intimately tied to the chaotic rise and fall of nations, they lost everything. They died before they could see the total destruction of their physical empire, but the erasure of their company was absolute. They didn't lose because a competitor outsmarted them. They didn't lose because their product failed. They lost because they built a machine so powerful that the world decided it was too dangerous for them to keep. The next time you hear a bolt click into place, remember the two brothers from Oberndorf. They built the greatest tool of its kind in human history, changed the world forever, and were left with absolute